Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Clarendon Chronicles Podcast. My guest today is none other than Professor David Clutterbuck, who's been at the leading edge of coaching, mentoring, and leadership for more than 45 years. David is one of the pioneers and foremost global authorities in coaching and mentoring, and a prolific author of over 80 books on coaching, mentoring, leadership, and management, many of which I have on my own bookshelves, including Everyone Needs a Mentor, Mentoring in Action, and Coaching the Team at Work. He's also the co-founder of the professional accreditation organization, the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, which I'm a member, in addition to being visiting professor in the UK at Henley Business School, part of Reading University, Sheffield Hallam, Oxford Brookes, and York St John universities. A serial entrepreneur, David currently leads Clutterbuck Coaching Mentoring International, a global network of coaching and mentoring experts and trainers. He is a highly sought after global keynote speaker, and I'm incredibly privileged today that David has offered to share his time and his thought leadership on coaching and mentoring with my Clarendon Chronicles podcast. David, thank you so much for joining me today in what I know is such an incredibly busy schedule for you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, David. And may I start? I mentioned in the introduction, David, you're the pioneer in the coaching and mentoring world. What have you seen in terms of the changes to, let's call it, the industry of coaching and mentoring, and how has it developed over those 45 years?
So I don't think it was an industry at the beginning. It's sort of become an industry. We talk about a profession as well, although I like to make a distinction between profession and vocation. And I like to think of coaching and mentoring as being provocations, somewhere in the middle. But way back in the 1970s, when Timothy Galway started looking at sports coaching from a very different angle, and coaching up to that time, in its fairly modest history of a couple of hundred years, was basically it was instruction. It was tuition, and the very first coaches were at university, helping people to get through their exams. Then tennis coaches, then rowing coaches, then tennis coaches, dancing coaches even. But it was all about telling people how to do things.
So that show and tell model.
Yeah. And you know, that model of coaching was still predominant up until the mid 1990s. So there's been a bit. It's been a slow. Well, it depends how you measure it, but there has been a change over the decades. Whereas mentoring has been around for thousands of years. It's always been a non-directive way of working with people, and I define mentoring as using your wisdom to help somebody else become wiser. It's a form of dialogue. So what we see as coaching really only started to appear outside of the sports world in the late 1980s. At that point, we started to it gathered momentum very quickly, and we saw coaches adopting a lot of the style of a mentor. Now, in the States, they had a different history. They didn't really have any history of mentoring to speak of. I mean, you do find references to mentoring going on in the early 1900s in the States, but not very much. And a lot of problems arose because of one of the seminal pieces of research by a brilliant academic called Kathy Cram, who went out and asked 22 pairs of people to talk about the relationship that they had in terms of supporting somebody's career. So there was young people being supported by more senior people's career. And she drew some conclusions from that. She made, I think, a very basic mistake. And that has become clear since then. So she conflated the role of sponsor, someone who does things for you, who directs you, who gives you some strong guidance and maybe even some advice, with the role of being a mentor, who's somebody who helps you with the quality of your thinking.
Yeah.
And when we go back into history, to the story of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, using the Socratic method that we have, this asking of questions, the helping somebody to reflect. This was the origins of mentoring. And then in the court of King Louis, the Sun King in France, it was reinforced as a series of dialogues in helping a young prince to really think through his role and how he became the person that he needed to be for the good of. So this duality of role really muddied the waters. And then we saw primarily American coaches saying, well, these people called mentors are doing what we're doing, but they're doing it for free. Hang on. Let's create an artificial distinction between the two. So they just give advice. But it's not true. And actually, in the more recent research we've been doing about what mature coaches do, mature coaches use themselves and their own experience far more. In fact, mature coaches become much, much more like mentors, right? So they're focusing on not on a process of you've got to do it like this and you've got to ask this kind of question and so forth. That's not what mature coaches do. They leave all that stuff behind. They integrate what they do with who they are. And so it's effective coaching is, yes, there are some processes, some things, some substrates, but the key is about being, not doing. And when we look at the world around us now and we see the rise of the AI coach, the AI coach can do most of what a grow model coach can do, only better.
So that's the basic element of transactional coaching from the grow model from John Whitmore.
Yes, I mean John was not the only person who did it. It's a trio of people who developed this, but John's the one who promoted it most. And intriguingly, just before he died, he gave us an interview in which he said he wished he'd never promoted grow.
Right.
He said it should have been VRO for vision, but that didn't spell anything.
I understand.
And this obsession with having a goal first is very much a Western, particularly North American cultural phenomenon. When we go into other cultures in the Far East, for example, the goal is something that emerges from the conversation. And that's one of the big differences within coaching and mentoring too. That in mentoring, you don't, the emphasis on the goal is pretty vague. I want to advance in my career. I might like to become an HR director, for example. We have a big program for aspiring HR directors.
Yes.
That's a sort of vague vision of what you're going to do. It's not that, it's not got KPIs around it and everything, all that stuff that you would expect.
All that smart stuff. Yep.
Yeah. But then as you go into it, we find, as with the aspiring HR directors, is that what I want to do? Let's modify the goal. Let's see what happens. Let's maybe there are other things that I could expand into. Maybe I want to become a consultant instead. But the key of both effective coaching and effective mentoring is it evolves. It's emergent. It's not nice and neat and fixed.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's really fascinating. I think now that we live in the VUCA environment just highlights, and I think hopefully we can touch on AI and perhaps a little bit later as well. I mean, for many of my audience and my listeners, coaching and mentoring is one and the same thing. I think you just described a few differences there, but for people listening today as a learning intervention, what would you describe, David, as being the real key difference between perhaps a coach on maybe one issue, and as you described then, the mentor looking at the wider picture? What's really the difference between those two?
It obviously, a lot of it depends on the level you're working at. But a basic level coach and a line manager coach, there's not much difference between them. But a more experienced coach and or mentor, we start to see the real differences coming out. And the EMCC spent a lot of time investigating in this and come down to the basic conclusion that there are that effectively mentoring is coaching plus. So a mentor has same basic skills and abilities of a coach. They may not have the same toolkit, the process stuff, but they've got the same mindset, the same way of thinking about things, the ability to engage in a learning dialogue. But they bring two special things that a coach typically can't. So one of those things is all of their experience. Mm. The fact that they've been there, seen it and done it. And that enables them to ask more pointed questions. That enables them to more instinctively empathize with the situation the other person's in. Mm. So they're able to get closer in and build that deeper quality of rapport. It's still no surprise that most mentoring relationships result in friendship. Yeah. Whereas coaching that much more distant and rarely does that. And the second thing is that a mentor is far more likely to be a role model.
Right, I see.
And that skill of being an effective role model is it's not a passive issue. It's actually something that you do quite actively. Yeah. So it's a real competence and skill.
I think it's a really helpful description, because when I speak with potential clients and organizations, and my background in organizations as well, there is that misunderstanding that people speak to me around the fact that they've heard about coaching, they've heard about mentoring, they think it might be a good thing, but they're not quite sure which road to go down. I mean, in terms of coaching, David, if people are looking to engage a coach, what would you describe as the qualities of being a really good coach?
Well, it's again very contextual. Mm. So I've recently been in the Solomon Islands, and what does a good coach look like in the Solomon Islands? Well, it's not like you might find in in Westminster or New York. Mm. So one of the things that fascinated me was that in that culture there is a very strong oral tradition. I mean, we've lost a lot of that because we've been so for centuries we've written everything down. So the oral tradition is diminished, but there they've got a story for everything. There's something that an interpretation of the world around them. So there's a parable, and so the coach and the coachee will come together, and they will often identify a story, a parable, if you like, something that's similar. And we do. I mean, coaches often use things. They would say, well, let's have an analogy. The ugly duckling, or what Grimm's fairy tale works for you. So we do this, but they've got a much bigger repertoire of these, and then they look at the issue together through the eyes of the parable. And then what fascinated me even more was they said, and sometimes there's a dance attached to the parable. So we'll do the dance together to actually build that quality of rapport. I mean, this is constellations on steroids. It's wonderful stuff. Now, so it is very contextual and cultural. And I think one of the big issues that we have at the moment is the great pushback across the world against the idea that there's only one way of doing coaching that happens to be a North American invented way. Yeah. And I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah, I absolutely concur with that. And when I'm engaged, I'm sure you've done it many more times than I have. As you said, the context and the perspective is really important in terms of whether it's coaching on that one particular single issue and that self-awareness of wanting change, as opposed to maybe that wider area you described there, the idea that somebody saw that big picture vision of trying to be an HR director or people director or CFO, something like that. And I see it change all of the time with the people that I'm engaging with. So yeah, thank you for that. And for those of us as coaches and mentors, hopefully a lot of those people will be listening. And what do we need to have as coaches and mentors to be a really good coach? So you're looking for people looking for coaches, they're looking for those descriptions that you mentioned. What can we always improve on as a coach?
So we've got something called the Coach Maturity Research Group, and we came together to revisit research that David Megerson and I did nearly 20 years ago. And in that original research, we were trying to understand the mindsets that coaches have at different stages in their development. And we very quickly identified through coach assessment centers that we were running for big banks and NHS and others, we identified 4 very clear ways of thinking about your identity as a coach. And the first of these was a very basic level coach. We called them models-based coach, because you've got a model like the GROW model or something like that, and you make the client fit your model. So you're doing coaching to that person. Yeah. A lot of the coaching that we see around the world it fits into that model. And I think it's particularly prevalent in ICF terms among ACC coaches. We see when we observe them at work, you're obsessed with the process and doing it right, which is not necessarily that helpful. But you can argue that you've got to start somewhere, and that therefore but the critical thing is what you let go of. And this letting go of the process, and actually letting go of the control, and actually letting the client have more say, having a bigger portfolio of approaches, that's more typical of the second sort of identity or mind frame, which we would call process oriented. So you've got a bigger range of things, but you're doing coaching with the client. And then at the third stage that we identified, and I use the word stage there, but we have some difficulties with the word stage, which I'll come to. But the third identity, you stop doing coaching and you start to be a coach. It's about integrating who you are as a human being with what you do as a coach. And in order to do that, you've got to let go of goal obsession. You've got to let go of all sorts of the process. You've got to actually focus on the conversation. Yeah. And then the small proportion of amazingly brilliant coaches that we saw, we call them systemic eclectics, because they see the client in their systems. They have empathy, not just with the client, but with the client system. And we describe them as holding the client while the client has the conversation they need to have with themselves. And what we've since found in the more recent research is we thought we could just repeat the original research. And we said, well, hang on, no, let's do it differently. Let's go to very mature coaches, people who are recommended by other coaches that they look up to, and talk to them about their journey. And what comes out again is some very clear themes. A lot of letting go, a lot of personal reflection, and increasing amounts of using yourself. Now, again, it's not about giving advice. It's about giving context. When you give somebody context, you help them with the quality of their thinking. When you give somebody advice, you're doing the thinking for them.
Right. I'd just like to come back to one of those issues there. I'm thinking that some of our listeners, when you mention systems there, I've worked, you've worked in organizations for longer than I have, but my previous experience, pre-coaching and mentoring, was as a CFO in organizations. And having read your research, your books, you mentioned David Megerson, all of the other incredibly well-known authors in coaching and mentoring. I now look back on my, let's call it my executive career, and I'm amazed that we were so dysfunctional. And I wonder how we managed to achieve anything at all of any substance, given that all of the issues that you describe in your research, I recognize, and I'm sure lots of other people will recognize. And I wonder, perhaps for our listeners, you mentioned the system there. And by that, do you mean, David, the complex adaptive system, the way that our organizations work? What are some of the mistakes that we make in our organizations that we can rectify quite quickly in terms of, and I'm thinking maybe the difference between individual coaching and team coaching, and how we can perhaps move between the two or do both? What are those mistakes that we make, David?
Well, we did a piece of research for the conference board last year, and one of the on post-COVID leadership, and one of the factors that came out very strongly was that many senior leaders in organisations are really struggling to let go of command and control, but most importantly, to think systemically. They can't do it. It's too complicated for them. And I like Dave Snowden's model, the Cuneiform model, which I can never pronounce it right. But it basically, you've got simple issues, you've got complicated issues, you've got complex issues, and you've got chaotic issues. What we're increasingly seeing is that coaches are working at increasing levels of complexity. Right. So when you've been doing some basic skills coaching for somebody, or some basic behavioural coaching, you're at the very bottom levels of for an individual. You're at the bottom levels of complexity, and the value you can add is therefore is commensurate with that. The more complex the issue gets, so working with a team leader to help them create a coaching culture in their team is a lot more complex. Working with the team itself and the team leader together is a magnitude, a order of magnitude more complex again. Working with the team of teams, which is one of the areas where I'm particularly focused at the moment, developing tools and techniques for doing that. We're again going higher and higher. We've identified 10 levels of complexity that coaches can theoretically at least work in. The way that coaches add value in the future and outpace the AI that's snapping at their heels is actually by going into higher and higher levels of complexity. Now, in order to do that, in terms of the teams, we've had to really investigate what actually happened. What are the dynamics of a team? And when somebody says we've got a problem with psychological safety in our team or conflict in our team, the normal assumption that the coach or a management consultant would make is, right, let's put up something that's if it's conflict, let's have some team building or do something like that. But actually, when you step back from it, you realize that the conflict is actually a symptom of factors that are interpolated, there are other factors in the background. And so team coaching is increasingly at the complex adaptive systems level, is increasingly focusing on the team's understanding of its internal dynamics, the dynamics of the system that surrounds it, and the interface between them. So it's enabling the team to work within the complexity of its environment. And that's what we've been training hundreds of coaches to do. And we've developed based on our research, we've developed a diagnostic that still blows my mind in terms of its ability to cut through the complexity. It's called the peril diagnostic. And what it does is it takes the 6 factors that interact to create good or bad performance in a team. And we haven't yet. We've had data now on over 500 teams. We haven't yet found any significant issue that a team faces which is not a combination of some of those factors. And this is really heartening, because what it means is that the coaches can really help those team leaders to understand the dynamics of the team and have the conversations with the team that team needs.
Yeah. And for our listeners, the peril stands for what? So you've got that underpinning of leadership in there, but what do the other elements around there? Because I recognize, and I'm sure the audience today will recognize all of the things that you've mentioned there, David, around that you can't quick fix a team that's dysfunctional by sending them away for a day and a half, doing karaoke in the evening, and doing the let's row a boat with a blindfold on, sort of the old-fashioned kind of things. But there seems to, again, just unpacking, there's so much there that you mentioned that is almost mind-blowing to think, how do we manage all of these things? Perhaps you could explain perhaps a little bit more about that model, which I think would really help people listening.
Okay, so the six elements are, the first one is purpose, or to be more exact, purpose and motivation. So what on earth are we here for? Are we all aligned about that? And does it motivate us? Are we energized by the purpose that we have? And there's masses of support in the Teams literature, the evidence base for this. The second factor, again, with massive support for it, is external relationships. So do our stakeholders want us to succeed? Are they providing us with the resources that we need? Are we listening to them? Are they listening to us? All of those factors, the relationships with our stakeholders, are very significant. Then you've got the relationships internally. So that's the R. We're primarily talking here about psychological safety, but also the collaborative skills, the feeling, the fact that people can be authentic and say what they feel and think rather than what they feel they should say. And we know, again, from the work of Amy Edmondson, again, that this is a significant factor in the performance of teams. The I is the internal systems, that whole bundle of stuff, from how you make decisions to how you communicate to how you structure the work. That's the sort of traditional stuff that we've been looking at in terms of team improvement or consultancy around teams. And then the first of the two L's is the learning. So how does the team keep abreast with the need to change to its environment? And one of the innovations that we've now got lots of organizations using is a team development plan. So it's a bridge between the business plan and the personal development plans. How do you integrate the learning at a team level? And then, as you said, leadership is the substrate underneath all of this. And by leadership, we don't mean being the leader. We mean the exercise of accountability and responsibility. And that's a sort of intervening or intermediating variable. And every issue that we've been able to identify in teams is a combination of several of these factors. And we can use this framework to investigate a team, to help a team understand itself. For example, by getting the team to come with 2 or 3 examples of when things have gone really well and 2 or 3 examples of when they haven't. And so when you look at, when things have gone well, what was happening in the interface between our sense of purpose and our relationships with our stakeholders. And when it wasn't going so well, what was happening there? Very quickly, you can identify through 2 or 3 examples the hidden dynamics, the things that contribute or undermine performance. Or you can use the diagnostic. We've been experimenting with the diagnostic now. It's for 2 years now, gathering data, reformulating it, making it more and more powerful and more useful. And what teams are now able to do is to get a fascinating insight into how they really function. And one of the key things about it is it doesn't give you average. I mean, we'll give you an average if you want it, but it looks at the differences in perception amongst team members or between team members and the stakeholders, to enable you to have the coaching conversations why do we have differences? What's the impact of those differences in perception? And so it gives so much more power to the individual team to make changes happen, to the extent that we've actually in consultation with a couple of organizations internationally about replacing their employee engagement survey. Because the employee engagement survey just tells you things are wrong, it doesn't tell you what to do about it. But you've got much more useful data here. So I'm absolutely amazed at what comes out of simply initiating those conversations.
I think the 2 things I would draw out of that immediately is it feels very much then as coaches and mentors, we need to be thinking team coaching and team of teams coaching rather than individual coaching. And even if that isn't presented to us as the desired intervention by clients, we at least need to be having that in our thought process around if we're struggling with an individual coaching program. And I agree, I think it absolutely needs to be aligned between individual objectives and strategic objectives within an organization. And that needs to be an overriding element of our coaching. And I also wonder whether we are focusing far too much on perhaps historical, outdated team models, such as many people will have heard of Lencioni's 5 levels of dysfunction, and the Tuckman model, norming, storming, forming.
Yes.
Are they in the past, David, or are they still relevant, or were they never relevant?
I think they may be helpful in some circumstances in initiating a broad discussion. In terms of the science behind both of them, it's nonsense. If you take Lencioni's model, it cherry picks a few issues or few themes within that come out of the literature, but ignores others like the external influences. And yes, there may well be examples of where one level in the experiment leads to another, but you can you can see many examples where things go the opposite way around, and it's much more complex than that. It's an overly simplistic piece of consultantese. It's been described as pop science elsewhere, and I think that's pretty accurate. And Tuckman, bless him, he did this wonderful study of people in therapy groups. And so this was a macro study of people, of different studies of people with depression and other mental problems, and how they eventually came together to support each other. And again, some consultants after a quick buck said, "Oh, that's a good idea. Let's make that a model of how teams form." But it's nothing. I mean, would you really want to create a model to base your ideas on team formation around people who are mentally ill? I mean, I've seen a few boards where we've wondered whether they've done that, but it's
interesting, isn't it? Because that's a really well-known model, and it came up in my academic work. And when speaking to people about team development, that's probably one of the ones that is uppermost. And what we're really saying is there's a limited sample size there, and yet it's really, really well known. I think that's fascinating, David. It's what would you say, David, as well, to the people who perhaps don't see coaching and mentoring as the most obvious form of intervention in organizations? So there's that element of resistance, hostility, in that it's not one of the more traditional methods, so let's resist it. Do you still come across that in organizations, David?
To some extent we do, but if you take it back, let's forget the labels, because they can be confusing anyway. People can have different ideas what coaching is, different ideas what mentoring is, and we know that it's contextual internationally. But having a learning dialogue, having those conversations that with people that enable that bring about change, and if you define it in that way, it's simply a function of leadership. And in fact, my favorite definition of leadership is the conversations that move mountains. And if we put it into that kind of, do you want to have better conversations that actually lead to more powerful outcomes? In which case, the many of the concepts of coaching and mentoring are going to be helpful. And let me go back a second. Can I just go back a second to the Tuckman? One of the things that we've been experimenting with quite a few organizations now, we've been developing basically programs that help them really help their managers think through what we call rapid teaming. So how do you create a team that hits the ground running and is high performing from day one? And of course, what the Tuckman model has done is to make people think you've inevitably got to go through this tortuous process of getting to know each other and storming and sort of. It's not true. Even a new team forming with effective team coaching in place from day one doesn't have to go through any of this storming curve. It can go very quickly to being a high performing team. And out of our research, we've gone and asked people what actually happens in teams that just gelled. What happened? And we're very clearly able to see it's a very simple process, step-by-step process that starts off being very clear before you start the team. What its purpose is, what the resources you have available to you are, how you're going to select the team members, etc. But once you get going, it's about how you quickly share the content and understand the contribution each of you wants to make and set the ground rules for what you want to do. And once you've got this, doesn't need to take that much time if it's done effectively.
Okay, David, I think that's an unbelievably deep understanding of where we can get to. In terms of, we started the conversation by thinking about the changes over the last 45 years. What do you think are the biggest challenges that we face now in coaching and mentoring? You've touched on AI. You've mentioned complex environments. What are the biggest changes that we face right now?
Well, I think we are going to see AI replacing a lot of basic level coaches. And so one of the challenges is, where do coaches get their experience, so that they can, if they want to start at the bottom, how do you go up? And one of the answers to that seems to be that actually maybe we need to shift the whole focus of coach education, and move that away from learning a whole bunch of tools and techniques and rules to actually making it experiential. A lot more of role plays, of observed coaching, and so helping people and to reflect on their practice, and that's really where we perceive the growth comes, is reflecting on your practice. You can't reflect on a model very easily, but you can reflect on what happened in this situation and that situation. So I think we're going to see a big shift in that direction. I think we are already seeing strong moves for the decolonization of coaching, for recognizing the value of diverse approaches to coaching and mentoring. Now, this has been a value of the EMCC since it started in 1991. But I would say we lost a little bit of sight with it when we got involved with competencies and standards, and we've sort of now gone back to the roots. And recognize that there's not just one way of doing things. And the other factor I think it's important is the democratization of coaching. Now, I know people like Better Up have taken that phrase and used it. What they mean basically is commoditizing of coaching, and I don't necessarily mean that in a negative term. Making it available to more people, which is fine. But your school teacher in rural Uganda doesn't have access to a computer even, so they're not going to be able to afford even the levels of fees that you might expect from a professional coach through one of the platforms. So how do we make coaching and mentoring a core skill? What I call the 4th R. You've got reading, writing, arithmetic, and reflective ability. And we've got this program we've been experimenting for some time now. We've got 3 experiments going on at the moment, which we hope will be the last before we actually go launch this. But we've been working with kids as young as 8 to help them become coaches and mentors to their peers. And it's amazing how quickly. It is quite amazing how quickly they get it. Now, they're not going to have all that, the experience, the wisdom, and everything to operate at the level of our most mature coaches. And that's okay. That's fine. But having those skills now, taking those into the workplace and into the university and elsewhere, that's going to really stand them in good stead. And our objective, once we launch, is within 5 years or so to get to 5 million school-age coaches and mentors globally.
It's never too early to start. David, I think there's some real elements of wisdom in what you described. And I think one of the things you just mentioned there is that if we can do this with people at a younger age, one of the things I found is that when people are considering coaching and mentoring, it's sometimes seen as almost irrelevant, and there's that what I would call the perception of perfection in people operating in leadership positions, in that, well, we've hired you, we've employed you, we pay you some money, and why on earth would you need coaching and mentoring? So I guess my final question is, for those people considering organizations, individuals, teams, leadership boards and other forums, why in a nutshell should people think coaching and mentoring is an intervention which can be incredibly valuable compared to others in an organization?
So I think there are a number of basic costs of financial calculation we do. I sometimes refer to COCO, the cost of cock-ups. What happens? What are the costs for people who aren't thinking things through properly? And good coaching discipline can really help them to do that, and particularly team coaching. So if every team in your organization were performing or were able to increase its performance by 10%, what would the impact on the bottom line be? And what about retention? Every organization has, or pretty much has a problem with retaining its talent. And yet we know from mentoring, for example, that in every study that's been made, mentoring has improved the retention of staff compared with people who are mentored versus people who are not, by a third or more. There's very good, strong financial reasons for doing this.
I'm glad you said that, David, because as I think you know, I did my master's degree research project specifically on the evaluation of development coaching and mentoring, and I did that because of some of the things that you mentioned there, even though there's not a great deal of consensus either from a practitioner sense or an academic sense, but I think it's absolutely tangible and you can see the results. So David, thank you so much for your time today. Vast experience that you shared, just elements of it today, and your huge knowledge of coaching, mentoring, and leadership. I'm sure that the audience today will have found this discussion to be hugely insightful, educational, inspirational in equal measure. I'm particularly going to take away those models of COCO and Peril in equal measure. David, it's been my pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much again, and hopefully we might get the opportunity to do another podcast on maybe just one or two discrete areas of coaching. But thank you again so much, and bye for now from the Clarendon Chronicles Podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, David.